Rome, 65 AD. The Emperor Nero has just kicked his pregnant wife, Poppaea Sabina, to death in a fit of rage. Days later, racked with guilt, he does something almost incomprehensible. According to the Roman historian Pliny the Elder, Nero orders the entire city's remaining supply of cinnamon burned on her funeral pyre. Not a handful, not a ceremonial pinch. By some estimates, an entire year's import for the whole of Rome. At a time when this spice was already valued far above silver, and by some accounts above gold itself, ounce for ounce. Think about that for a second. He didn't burn treasure chests, he didn't burn coin, he burned bark. A dried, curled strip of tree skin, no bigger than a pencil, that had travelled thousands of miles to reach him. So how did tree bark become worth more than precious metal? Why would merchants risk their lives crossing deserts and oceans for something you can find in your kitchen cabinet today for a couple of dollars? And why did the people controlling this trade spend nearly 3,000 years lying deliberately, elaborately about where it actually came from? The answer involves fabricated monsters, a hidden empire, and a deception so effective it fooled the ancient world for centuries. Let's start at the very beginning. Around 450 BC, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote down one of the strangest supply chain stories in human history. According to the merchants of his day, cinnamon didn't come from a tree at all. It came from giant birds. These birds, they claimed, built their nests out of cinnamon sticks, high on unreachable cliffs somewhere in Arabia. To harvest it, brave traders supposedly left out huge chunks of ox meat near the base of the cliffs. The birds would swoop down, grab the meat, and haul it back up to their nests. The extra weight, the story went, would cause the nest to crack apart and tumble to the ground, scattering cinnamon sticks for collection. Herodotus himself seemed skeptical even as he wrote it down, and a later writer, Pliny the Elder, openly called the tale suspicious in his own accounts a few centuries after. It's an absurd story. Nobody spreading it truly believed birds built nests from spice. So why tell it? Because the real source of cinnamon was somewhere in South and Southeast Asia, likely Sri Lanka or the Malabar coast of India, and the Arab traders who controlled the overland and sea routes had zero interest in Roman, Greek, or Egyptian buyers ever finding that out. Every leg of the journey, every hand it passed through, added another markup. Cut out the middlemen, and the whole business collapses overnight. So the middlemen invented monsters instead. For roughly 1,000 years, this worked. Wealthy elites across the ancient Mediterranean paid absurd prices for something that, geographically, wasn't even that far from established trade networks. They just weren't allowed to know it. And here's the part that should bother you. Nobody ever caught the lie by asking sharper questions. It survived for an entirely different reason, because at least one ancient ruler tried to go around the lies completely, and even she couldn't quite finish the job. Long before Rome existed, Egypt was already obsessed with cinnamon. Embalmers used it, mixed with other resins, in the mummification process as far back as the 2nd millennium BC, a substance considered pure and valuable enough to accompany royalty into the afterlife. But Egypt had no idea where it actually grew. Around 1470 BC, the pharaoh Hatshepsut, one of the few women to rule Egypt in her own right, organised a famous trading expedition to a land the Egyptians called Punt, a region whose exact location historians still debate today, somewhere along the Horn of Africa or the southern Red Sea coast. Temple reliefs at her mortuary temple in Deir el-Bahari depict ships returning loaded with incense trees, exotic goods, and aromatic materials that some scholars connect to the broader spice trade of the era. It's tempting to imagine this as the moment Egypt finally cracked the source of cinnamon. It wasn't Punt was almost certainly a trading hub, not the origin point, another link in a chain that stretched much further east toward lands Egyptian ships never reached. Even a pharaoh with the resources to commission an entire naval expedition couldn't shortcut the network. The secret held, and it would keep holding generation after generation, empire after empire, long after Egypt itself had faded from the centre of world power. By the height of the Roman Empire, cinnamon had become a status symbol woven into religion, medicine, and even death itself. Roman physicians prescribed it for everything from indigestion to snake bites, most of which it almost certainly did nothing for, but the belief in its power only inflated demand further. Temples burned it as incense. The wealthy sprinkled it into wine. According to some ancient price records, a pound of premium cinnamon could cost the equivalent of several months' wages for an ordinary labourer, depending on the quality and the year. And yet, demand never dropped, even as the empire itself began cracking apart. Why? Because control of cinnamon never actually ran through Rome. It ran through a long chain of Arab, Persian, and Indian intermediaries who answered to nobody in Europe and had no stake in Roman politics whatsoever. Kingdoms could rise, kingdoms could burn, the spice kept moving along the same maritime and overland routes, guarded by the same commercial secrecy that had protected it for centuries. This is the part people miss when they imagine ancient trade as chaotic and disconnected. It wasn't. It functioned like a quiet, durable cartel, largely immune to the political chaos of the very civilizations paying for it. Rome split into east and west. The western half collapsed entirely by 476 AD. Constantinople endured, became Byzantium, and kept importing spices through the same Arabian and Red Sea networks for centuries more. Empires fractured. The cinnamon kept flowing, priced the same way, wrapped in the same old myths about birds and cliffs. One fact held the entire system together. As long as Europe didn't know where the spice actually grew, Europe would keep paying whatever price it was told to pay. That illusion lasted for another 1,000 years after Rome fell, until one continent finally got desperate enough and technologically capable enough to go looking for the source itself. Here's the uncomfortable answer. Because it worked. And because nobody in a position of power actually benefited from the truth getting out. This is one of the oldest patterns in economic history, and you'll recognise it instantly. Whoever controls information about scarcity controls the price. It didn't matter that cinnamon trees grew in dense, fragrant abundance on a specific island in the Indian Ocean, tended by local communities who had harvested the bark for generations using well-established techniques. What mattered was that nobody outside that region could verify any of it. Distance was the product. Mystery was the packaging. By some estimates, cinnamon changed hands through as many as a dozen separate merchants between its point of origin and a wealthy household in Rome or Alexandria, each one adding their own markup, each one with every financial incentive imaginable to keep the fiction alive. Consider the geography involved. A shipment might move from Sri Lankan or South Indian ports across the Arabian Sea, up through the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, overland by camel caravan through Arabia, and finally by ship again across the Mediterranean. At every single stop, someone took a cut, and someone repeated the story about birds and cliffs to justify it. Arab and later Nabatean traders based in cities like Petra grew extraordinarily wealthy, controlling exactly this kind of relay trade in frankincense, myrrh and spices. And here's the twist that makes this genuinely dark. The myth of monster birds and impassable cliffs wasn't just clever marketing, it actively discouraged exploration. Nobody sails toward a cliff guarded by giant carnivorous birds. Fear itself functioned as the security system, cheaper and more effective than any army. It worked for close to 1,000 years. But eventually, the profits at stake grew so enormous that entire nations became willing to risk the birds. The real source, it turns out, was Ceylon, the island known today as Sri Lanka. Wild cinnamon trees, specifically the species we now call Cinnamomum verum, or true cinnamon, grew there in dense, fragrant groves along the island's wetter southwestern regions. For centuries, local kingdoms controlled the harvest and sold it onward through Arab intermediaries, operating out of coastal trading posts without ever needing to reveal the island's exact location to outsiders. For medieval Europeans, Ceylon existed mostly as a rumour, a name occasionally mentioned by Arab, Persian, and later Venetian traders, but never confidently located on any map they actually trusted. Medieval European cartography of Asia was, frankly, terrible. Maps from the period show vague coastlines, entirely invented islands, and enormous blank spaces filled with little more than educated guesses and biblical references. Into that blank space, the old myths kept growing and mutating. Some medieval European writers claimed cinnamon grew in a swamp guarded by winged serpents. Others insisted it came from somewhere near the literal Garden of Eden, tying the spice to religious imagination rather than geography. Venice, meanwhile, grew enormously rich during this period as the primary European gateway for spices arriving via Alexandria and the Eastern Mediterranean, controlling that final leg of distribution into European markets and guarding its own position just as jealously as the Arab traders guarded theirs further east. None of the myths were true, and none of them needed to be, because the alternative, actual geographic knowledge in the hands of rival powers threatened an entire economic system built on controlled ignorance. But by the late 1400s, something fundamental changed. European monarchies, particularly Portugal and Spain, had grown wealthy enough and hungry enough to fund something previous centuries simply couldn't. Long-distance ocean voyages specifically designed to sail around the entire Arab and Venetian trade network and reach Asian sources directly. The mystery of the Spice Island was about to collide head-on with the age of exploration. And when it did, the results were far bloodier than almost anyone in Europe anticipated. In 1498, Vasco da Gama's expedition became the first European voyage to reach India by sea, rounding the southern tip of Africa and opening a maritime route that finally bypassed the Arab and Venetian middlemen entirely. It took a few more years for Portuguese ships to push further and reach Ceylon itself, arriving around 1505 under a fleet led by Dom Lourenço de Almeida, whose ships were reportedly blown off course toward the island by a storm. What they found was exactly what centuries of merchants had hidden: wild cinnamon trees growing along the coastline in such abundance that, according to some early European accounts, sailors claimed they could smell the island's cinnamon groves from out at sea before land was even visible. There were no monster birds, no winged serpents, just trees and generations of Sinhalese knowledge about how to harvest and process the bark properly. The Portuguese response wasn't curiosity, it was conquest. Within a few decades, they had established fortified trading posts along the coast, most notably at Colombo, forced local rulers into tribute arrangements demanding fixed annual quantities of cinnamon, and began exporting the spice back to Europe at a fraction of what the old Arab-controlled overland route had cost, while still charging European buyers nearly the same premium prices as before. Profits didn't just increase, they multiplied dramatically. And here's the irony worth sitting with for a moment. For close to 1,000 years, secrecy about geography had propped up the price of cinnamon. Once that secret was finally gone, the price in Europe barely moved because a new kind of control simply replaced the old one control of the physical supply itself. It no longer mattered whether Europe knew exactly where cinnamon came from. What mattered now was who held the coastline, the harbours, and the harvest. Portugal held all three for roughly a century. Then a far more ruthless and better organised competitor arrived from the north, and Portugal's grip on the world's most valuable bark began to crack apart. By the 1630s, the Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials as the VOC, and often described by historians as the first true multinational corporation, complete with its own private army, navy, and the legal power to wage war, had set its sights firmly on Ceylon. They didn't just want to trade cinnamon, they wanted to own the entire supply chain completely, the way a modern company might try to patent a living organism. The VOC formed a military alliance with the Kingdom of Kandy, the last independent Sinhalese kingdom on the island, against their mutual Portuguese enemy. Through a series of campaigns, they gradually drove Portugal out of its coastal strongholds, finally capturing Colombo in 1656 and consolidating full control of the cinnamon-producing lowlands by around 1658. What followed was one of the most extreme trade monopolies in recorded history. The Dutch didn't simply control exports, they controlled the trees themselves. Cutting down a wild cinnamon tree without explicit company permission became a punishable crime. Cultivating the plant outside company-approved plantation zones was banned outright. In a move that reveals just how far this went, the VOC deliberately restricted the total quantity of cinnamon harvested and shipped each year, specifically to keep prices artificially inflated in European markets, a strategy modern economists would instantly recognise as supply-side manipulation, executed centuries before anyone had a formal name for it. At the peak of this system, cinnamon is estimated by some historians to have generated profit margins on individual shipments running into the hundreds of %, and it represented one of the most consistently profitable single commodities in the VOC's entire Asian trading portfolio for well over a century. Local Sinhalese farmers, meanwhile, were bound into a hereditary labour caste system tied specifically to cinnamon peeling, known as the Salagama caste, with fixed annual quotas that families were legally obligated to fulfil regardless of hardship. Failure to deliver the required harvest could result in severe punishment. The corporation that made cinnamon a byword for refined luxury in Amsterdam's grand merchant houses built that entire luxury economy on a foundation that almost no European buyer ever saw, and fewer still wanted to. Here's what rarely makes it into the romantic version of the spice trade story. The Salagama and other Sinhalese communities who had cultivated and harvested cinnamon for centuries before any European ships arrived were locked under Dutch rule into a rigid caste-based labour obligation specifically tied to cinnamon peeling, a practice that required real skill bark had to be stripped in specific seasons in thin curls and dried under controlled conditions to produce a marketable product. Entire families were bound to this work whether they wanted to be or not, generation after generation, with the obligation passed down as a matter of hereditary status rather than choice. Quotas were strict and non-negotiable, and the documented consequences for missing them included forced additional labour, fines, and corporal punishment recorded in Dutch colonial administrative sources from the period. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Europe, cinnamon sticks were being ground into powdered luxury, sprinkled over spiced wine, baked into elaborate pastries for aristocratic tables in Amsterdam, Paris, and London, entirely disconnected from the coercion behind every single harvest. This is a pattern that repeats across nearly every major colonial commodity of this era. Sugar, grown on slave plantations in the Caribbean, spices extracted under quota systems across the Indian Ocean, and later rubber and cotton harvested under similarly brutal colonial regimes in Africa and Asia. A product becomes a symbol of refinement and comfort in one part of the world, specifically because of systematic coercion in another. And there's a bitter irony buried in here too, one the Dutch never saw coming. The VOC went to extraordinary lengths, including outright bans and occasional executions for smuggling live plants or seeds to prevent cinnamon trees from ever being successfully cultivated anywhere outside their controlled territory, believing geographic exclusivity was their monopoly's ultimate protection. They were wrong. Nature doesn't respect trade agreements or company charters. And the very thing they feared most, the plant quietly escaping their control, was already happening, carried by birds, ocean currents, and eventually by human hands that no company monopoly could fully police. Cinnamon trees, it turns out, can grow successfully well outside Ceylon, given the right tropical climate and enough patience. The British, who first seized Dutch-controlled coastal areas of Ceylon in 1796 and later took the entire island, including the inland kingdom of Kandy, by 1815, initially tried to maintain the same monopoly structure they had inherited, but the economics had already started shifting beneath them. By the late 1700s and increasingly through the 1800s, cultivation had spread, sometimes through smuggled seedlings, sometimes through separate independent discovery to parts of southern India, Southeast Asia, and eventually the Seychelles and other tropical island regions. At the same time, a related but botanically distinct tree, Cinnamomum cassia, native to southern China and long used in Chinese medicine and cooking for thousands of years, entered global trade in far larger volumes and at dramatically lower cost. Cassia looks similar, tastes similar, though noticeably stronger and slightly bitter, and could be produced far more cheaply than Ceylon's labour-intensive true cinnamon. This is the twist that quietly ended a 2,000-year monopoly. The market simply widened underneath it, and a cheaper competitor flooded in from an entirely different direction than anyone controlling Ceylon had anticipated. As exclusive control loosened and cassia production scaled up dramatically through the 19th century, cinnamon prices began a long, steady, irreversible decline. What was once worth more than gold by weight became, within a couple of centuries, something available at a market stall for roughly the price of a loaf of bread. Supply had finally caught up with 3,000 years of artificially inflated demand. And here's a detail that connects directly to your own kitchen right now. Most of what's sold today as plain cinnamon in North American grocery stores isn't true Ceylon cinnamon at all. It's cassia, the cheaper, stronger flavoured cousin that helped break the original monopoly wide open. True Ceylon cinnamon, sometimes explicitly labelled true cinnamon, or Ceylon cinnamon to distinguish it, remains noticeably pricier and harder to find on ordinary supermarket shelves. A faint, lingering echo of a trade war fought over bark for the better part of 3 millennia. By the 20th century, cinnamon had completed one of the strangest transformations in the entire history of commodities. A spice once so valuable that a Roman emperor burned an entire fortune of it in a single act of grief, once guarded for 1,000 years by fabricated monsters, once fought over by rival colonial trading companies with private armies and warships, had become a cheap pantry staple sitting quietly in nearly every supermarket aisle on Earth. Global production today is measured in the hundreds of thousands of tonnes annually, spread across countries that centuries ago weren't meaningfully part of the trade at all. Indonesia and China now dominate global Cassia cinnamon production by volume, while Sri Lanka retains its identity as the world's primary source of the true Ceylon variety, still accounting for the large majority of true cinnamon exports worldwide and remaining an economically significant crop for the country. The price collapse across the 19th and 20th centuries wasn't gradual or gentle. It was the direct, almost accidental result of colonial power's own extraction efforts, eventually spreading cultivation knowledge, seedlings, and plant stock far beyond anyone's ability to contain it. Ironically, the very colonial systems built with the explicit goal of monopolizing cinnamon forever are a direct cause of why it's now one of the least expensive spices sold anywhere in the world. Meanwhile, the cultural memory of cinnamon's old extraordinary value never fully disappeared, it simply got rebranded for a new era. Today it shows up as a universal symbol of comfort and warmth rather than wealth. Holiday baking traditions across dozens of cultures, spiced lattes sold by the hundreds of millions every autumn, cinnamon rolls turned into a genuine cultural export from Scandinavian fika culture to American shopping malls. Modern research has also renewed interest in cinnamon for reasons entirely disconnected from its old trade value, with ongoing scientific studies examining its potential effects on blood sugar regulation and inflammation, though experts generally caution that these effects remain modest and shouldn't be treated as a substitute for medical treatment. The spice that once measured a person's wealth now mostly just measures a season, a mood, a scent tied to nostalgia rather than status. So here's where it all lands. Every time you shake cinnamon onto your oatmeal or order a spiced latte without thinking twice about the price, you're tasting the tail end of a 3,000-year economic war. A war that involved fabricated monsters invented specifically to protect ancient trade secrets, an emperor who burned a fortune of it to publicly mourn his wife, a Dutch corporation that criminalised the act of cutting down a single tree, a hereditary colonial labour system built entirely around keeping one plant scarce enough to stay precious, generation after generation. None of that history is visible in the little glass jar sitting on your spice rack right now. That's exactly the point. The things that feel most mundane and ordinary in our daily lives are very often sitting directly on top of the most extraordinary and frequently the most brutal chapters of human history. Cinnamon didn't get cheap because it stopped being valuable or because people simply stopped wanting it. It got cheap because the underlying secret finally got out, permanently, and no empire, no corporation, and no invented myth about giant birds could ever put that secret back in the bottle once it was released. Next time someone tells you a particular story is too small to matter, remember this one. An entire chain of empires, monopolies, forced labour systems, and elaborate myths was fought, sustained, and eventually broken over nothing more than curls of dried tree bark. If stories like this one, where the smallest, most everyday objects around you turn out to be hiding the biggest historical secrets, are exactly your kind of rabbit hole